Between 1936 and 1945, the political and military relationship between Japan and the Soviet Union was a high-stakes balancing act, one shaped by rivalry, ideology, and cold calculation. At the heart of their uneasy relationship was a contest for dominance in East Asia, a region on the brink of transformation torn by imperial ambition, revolution, and total war. This is the history of two rising powers, both determined to expand, both deeply suspicious of the other, and how their diplomacy, conflict, and strategy reshaped the fate of China, Manchuria, Korea, and ultimately World War II itself. By the mid-1930s, Japan was already deep into its imperial campaign. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 had led to the creation of Manchukuo, a puppet state controlled by the Japanese military. Tokyo's ambitions expanded beyond Manchuria, into China proper, Southeast Asia, and perhaps even into Soviet Siberia.
Meanwhile,
the Soviet Union, emerging from the chaos of the Civil War and Stalin's brutal purges, was watching both Germany and Japan with growing alarm. Japan and the Soviet Union shared a border stretching across Siberia, Manchuria, and Mongolia. That border was more than a line on a map. It was a geopolitical fault line. Became a turning point. In 1936, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany. Officially aimed at containing communism, it was also a warning. Japan saw the USSR not just as a rival, but as a threat to be contained or perhaps confronted. Finally, tensions erupted in 1939 along the border between Japanese-occupied Manchuria and the Soviet-backed state of Mongolia. In what became known as the Battle of Kholin Gol or the Nomonhan Incident, Soviet and Japanese forces clashed in a brutal border war. The Soviets, under General Gregory Zhukov, launched a daring encirclement operation involving tanks, aircraft, and coordinated infantry, hallmarks of the modern warfare that would define later battles in Europe. The Japanese Kuomintang army, overconfident and poorly prepared, was decisively defeated. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was an ideological and strategic wake-up call for Japan. The defeat shattered confidence in the so-called Strike North Doctrine, an idea pushed by the Imperial Army that called for a future war against the Soviet Union to claim territory in Siberia. Instead, Japan pivoted southward, toward the Pacific, where the Japanese would target British Malaysia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and other resource-rich areas controlled by other imperial powers. This not only led them on a collision course for war with the Allies, but also with the USA. While the Battle of Kholin Gol may not be widely remembered today, it made Imperial Japan reconsider and abandon its Strike North Doctrine, which made them choose the Strike South Doctrine, a doctrine that was proposed by the Imperial Navy, which would make them declare war on the already mentioned nations of British Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, leading them to war with the Allies and the USA. In the spring of 1941, as Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union and as the Japanese Imperial Navy made plans to attack Pearl Harbor, the diplomacy between the Imperial Japanese and the Soviet Union took an unexpected turn. Japan, despite winning the First Russo-Japanese War, needed to avoid a second war with the USSR, especially as it eyed expansion into Southeast Asia. The calculation of this diplomatic play to sign a neutrality act with Japan was even clearer and more important. With war against Germany now almost inevitable, Stalin needed to ensure peace in the East. The important thing to note is that the neutrality pact wasn't built on trust. It was built on mere timing, and timing was everything. The pact would hold, even after Germany's invasion of the USSR in June 1941. The important thing to understand is that the German and Japanese relationships were not exactly strong. They merely had the same intentions and the same ideology. Those were the only similarities. Both of them never had the same goals. And that would be why Japan never joined the war against the USSR. That decision, in hindsight, spared Japan from becoming embroiled in a two-front war and gave Stalin critical breathing room to turn the tide on the Eastern Front. Between 1941 and 1945, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets would remain firmly neutral in the Pacific War, but it was never indifferent. Stalin's paranoia about fighting Japan never really went away. In Mongolia, the USSR built up military infrastructure and continued to treat the country as a strategic buffer zone.
Meanwhile,
Japan tried to tighten its grip on China, stretch its empire across the Pacific, and battle the US and its allies. But beneath the surface, the Soviet-Japanese relationship remained fraught. However, while the Soviets were able to push the Germans back, the Japanese were overextended and were fighting three major powers at once, something that was not sustainable in the long run. The fairly weak relationships between the Soviets and the Japanese did lead to economic exchanges. Japan imported raw materials like timber and oil from the USSR, but these were driven more by necessity than goodwill. Both sides, throughout their diplomatic relationships, viewed the other as a potential threat. The Japanese feared that the USSR might betray the pact and open a second front in Manchuria. The Soviets, in turn, watched for any signs that Japan might support Germany's war in the West. This was diplomacy under duress, frozen but fragile. This fragile relationship between Imperial Japan and the USSR required extraordinary diplomatic movement and calculation. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, and at the Yalta Conference, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, made a secret deal. Stalin promised to join the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Stalin would keep his word. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Overnight, over 1 million Soviet troops poured into Manchuria. The Red Army moved with overwhelming speed and coordination, crushing any Japanese resistance and forces. The Red Army would occupy key territories and would advance into North Korea. This offensive dismantled Japan's last line of defense in Asia. It also crushed hopes in Tokyo that Stalin might mediate a peace deal with the Allies. While the atomic bombs get most of the attention, many historians argue that it was the Soviet invasion coming from an unexpected front that ultimately forced Japan's hand. However, as a young historian myself, it is important to note that it is usually not just one event that ends the war, and that this is still a debate. While yes, the Soviet invasion might have had an influence on Japan's surrender, it was not the main cause. Same with the nuclear bombs. It was in fact a series of events that led to the cause of the capitulation of Japan, not just one. Facing devastation from US and Allied bombing attacks and a total collapse of ground forces, Japan surrendered days later, bringing World War I and the Pacific War to an end.
核の分馬人何をもってか屋上の石州を欲し構想の神霊に所詮やこれ秦が帝国政府をして共同宣言に大勢占めるに至れるゆえんなり秦は帝国とともに終始東亜の解放に協力せる諸名法に対し遺憾の要表せざるを得ず帝国市民にして先人に死し宿域に順次悲鳴に倒れたる者及びその貴族に思いを致せば行いために咲くかつ戦勝を追い災禍を被り家業を失いたる者後世に至りては陳の深く信念するところなり思うに今後帝国の置くべき苦難はもとより尋常にあらず汝市民の中将も陳よくこれを知るしかれとも陳は自運の赴くところ耐え難きを耐え忍び難きを忍びもって万世のために太平を開かんと欲す陳はここに国体を保持し得て終了なる汝市民の適正に信し常に汝市民と共にありもしそれ上納撃するところ 乱れに時短を刺激し、あるいは同胞敗壊、互いに自力を乱り、ために大道を誤り、真理を世界に失うがごときは、真最もこれを戒む。よろしく、挙国一家、子孫愛たえ、固く真宗の不滅を信じ、任目して道東京を思い、総力を将来の建設に傾け、道義を厚くし、思想を固くし、誓って国体の成果を発揚し、世界の信に遅れざらんことを基礎べし、汝市民にそれよく賃愛を大せよ。
From 1936 to 1945, the relationship between Japan and the Soviet Union evolved from cautious confrontation to armed conflict, from a fragile peace to all-out invasion. This rivalry shaped key events in China, Korea, and Manchuria. It helped redirect Japan's military path, and it allowed the USSR to secure its eastern flank, while it fought for survival in the west. In the aftermath of the war, Japan was occupied by the United States. The Soviet Union took control of North Korea, laying the groundwork for the Korean War and the geopolitical divide that still exists today. The Kuril Islands, seized by the USSR in the final days of the war, remain disputed territory, with no peace treaty signed between Tokyo and Moscow to this day.